Good morning. Thank you to everybody who made this event possible, and thank you for the invite to be here. It's been a very stimulating workshop so far. So I'm going to be speaking about some work that's part of an ongoing project. I'm largely focusing on the Canadian context. We have a number of struggles over resources. So my work is looking at the emergence of critical infrastructure resilience as a national security strategy. In this work, I am really trying to situate Canada's security policy in general in the context of Canada as a settler colonial state. And so thinking about this policy shift from security to resilience in the context of those entwined logics of capital accumulation and colonialism. So I've taken a focus on the extractive industries, and the aim of the work is to consider, to try and map out whether and how this change in discourse is changing security practices, and secondly, to consider the implications for opposition or resistance movements, particularly for Indigenous peoples' self-determination. So this term, critical infrastructure, generally refers to not just physical installations, but also includes processes, systems, technologies, networks, services that are considered vital or essential to the life of population, the life of the economy, government, and therefore, are being framed as, essential to the survival of the nation state. So since the 1990s, critical infrastructure has become the main object of national security in Canada, as well as many other places. And like many other places, much of Canada's critical infrastructure, and the estimates vary quite a lot, but one estimate is about 85% is owned by private owners or operators, and especially higher concentrations in sectors like energy and utilities. From the early 2000s until about 2014, Canada's critical infrastructure security strategy is largely focused on building partnerships with with industry, right? So the owners and operators are seen as being essential to do national security. So it's not just the owner-operators, but also organizations like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers or the Pipeline Associations. And so the objective of those relationships was largely to increase the amount of information and intelligence sharing between, the industry, these owner-operators, government, and law enforcement agencies. And so they were sharing information largely around, potential risks to these infrastructures. Now, since 2014, the Canadian government has increasingly aimed to expand these partnerships beyond sharing information and intelligence, and moving towards thinking through how to encourage more private investments. So to get the owners and operators to put more into these infrastructures with the goal of building resilience. And so private investment is being promoted as a national security strategy. So with Canada's adoption of this resilience approach, critical infrastructure security strategy is increasingly emphasizing being preemptive. And so the idea here is that owner-operators and the state can capitalize on the possibilities of future risk. So rather than simply defend existing infrastructures from identifiable risks, resilience logic uses imagined future risk as a basis for enhancing infrastructure in the present. So the aim is to preempt possible disruptions, so the aim is to prevent possible disruptions to desirable future forms of circulation through these infrastructures. So the future of, say, oil and gas circulation. So rather than something to be avoided or prevented, the possibility that future disruption will have catastrophic effects on both existing and imagined infrastructures is being turned into new opportunities for accumulation. So this framing or this logic is evident in security strategy documents that I've been able to obtain through freedom of information requests. These documents describe resilience strategies as ongoing infrastructural investments as being beneficial to corporate interests and to stimulating economic growth, and that's in these policy documents. So again, this isn't an economic plan per se, but it's in national security policy. So while it seems new to the realm of national security and critical infrastructure protection, the preemptive anticipatory logic of resilience has a longer genealogy as a feature of accumulation logics and of settler colonialism's imaginative geographies. As Mark has stated, and I'm quoting, resilience is becoming one of the key ideological tropes underpinning the war of accumulation. And so in my work, I want to really emphasize the infrastructural war, to draw on Stephen Graham's work, that's at the root, right, is fundamentally taking place on land and against Indigenous people's self-determination and jurisdiction. So in this work, I'm sort of bringing together different literatures, and I'm interested in the pacification work that infrastructural power does. And here I'm drawing on insights from people like Michael Mann, Kellert Easterling, Leila Kamili, and Olive Wiseman. So while infrastructures are vital to the biopolitical life of population, economy, and the state, they're also necropolitical, taking life through physical violence, dispossession, criminalization, incarceration that are used in the process of building and securing those infrastructures. Furthermore, because infrastructures have the capacity to constrict or restrict circulation of food, water, healthcare, and mobility, infrastructural necropower operates by a letting die. And here I'm drawing on Lauren Berland's work on slow death. So the anticipatory dimension of infrastructure starts with territorializing and sort of a spatial reordering by emptying out, compartmentalizing, and carving out spaces for circulation. Now, in the colonial context, infrastructural projects begin as visions of desirable future spaces of non-Indigenous settlement and economic activities that are underpinned by the materiality of things like railways, roads, electricity transmission grids, water, water facilities, as well as pipelines, of course. And in this space, the presence of Indigenous peoples and nations is part of what Joseph Masco terms a threatogenic landscape, or to draw on Foucault, the milieu of circulation. So this Indigenous presence has been an enduring source of uncertainty and anxiety for the settler state and for these flows of global capital, through these infrastructures. So as experienced around the world, and certainly here, criminalization and surveillance have been key pacification strategies to manage potential disruptions and to clear the way for these infrastructural circulations. And in the Canadian context, there's been disproportionately more of this criminalization and surveillance on Indigenous communities simply by this jurisdictional presence. So the framing of critical infrastructure as vital to the population and to the national interest becomes a powerful means of depoliticizing and legitimizing these criminalization and surveillance practices. So the critical infrastructure resilience vision in Canada's national security policy presents another means of managing the uncertainties posed by political, environmental, Indigenous resistance movements. So it's working to turn the possibility of disruption into opportunities for new forms of accumulation. And there's at least 3 different ways that this is occurring. So one is that this idea of doing infrastructure resilience is based on a need to constantly assess, improve, renew, and enhance these infrastructures. And so this then fosters new industries and services right, to do that assessing, the evaluating, the improving. So we can include here things like the logistics industry, auditing and consultation services, and a wide range of elements within the standards industry. It also generates circulation, right, through this continuous demand for improvement as new kinds of imagined potential risks emerge. A second area where we see new forms of accumulation are through financialized and securitized capital. So infrastructures are increasingly desirable investments, and new financial instruments, such as there's this particular instrument in the Canadian context called flow-through shares in the resource and mining sector that allow project proponents, so industry, to mitigate risks to their projects, so the uncertainties of consultation processes. And these security or financial instruments let investors, right, buy these up and then get sort of tax breaks off of them. So there's wealth being generated without there being any shovels in the ground. So third, government commitments to this resilient future create opportunities and guarantees for investment. So in Canada, the federal government has continuously sort of opened up the market for infrastructural investment from the private sector. And this is part of a long-term economic growth strategy. In 2017, the government created the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and this entity will provide more subsidies and opportunities for public-private partnerships, opportunities for more direct private ownership. Or, as we've seen much more recently, there's sort of a guarantee from the government is that they could just buy the pipeline project. So this happened recently this summer. Canada purchased a pipeline extension project from Kinder Morgan, an American company, for $4.5 billion. And so they did this because Kinder Morgan threatened to abandon the project because of the significant amount of resistance that was being staged, particularly from the indigenous nations that were being most impacted, but also from provincial and municipal governments opposed to the project. And so without any construction happening, Kinder Morgan and their investors have already profited from this project. One analysis has estimated that the company will make a 637% return on the sale. So importantly, underlying this resilience approach, the security assemblage continues to play a key role. So it's not just all gone to this financial side. So the security assemblage still plays this role in greater collaboration with industry. And just to give you one example, I acquired a copy of a strategic analysis that was produced by the intelligence section of Canada's National Police Force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And this document focuses on British Columbia, which is on Canada's west coast, and where this Kinder Morgan pipeline is being contested. And so what's interesting about this strategic analysis is that it's focused on the emerging industry of natural gas pipelines and coastal liquefied natural gas terminals. So this document describes several projects at various stages of materialization, some existing, some in the process of being built, and some simply at a proposal phase. It identifies projected economic benefits, the degrees of opposition, and it also discusses the current and future economic contributions of the province's gas industry as a whole. Okay, so this is a police intelligence document that's discussing these future economic contributions. At the end of this report, there's an appendix with 3 maps. The first map maps out undiscovered resource estimates. The second map maps out existing markets. And the third map identifies future Asian markets for expansion. And this is really the key driver of Canada's national program of intensified extraction. So this analysis and this one particular document, like some of the other ones I've been able to obtain, are interesting because there's little attention to what we would conventionally think we would find in a police intelligence document. So there's very little focus on concrete, like, quote unquote, criminal threats. And so they're also interesting because there's an underlying assumption, right, that the expansion of the oil and gas industry is inevitable, that it's happening. And then that future must be secured through these preemptive measures, right, both the financial as well as the criminalization strategies. And so to close, so this work that I'm doing is to consider the implications of both the continuities and discontinuities of these anticipatory logics of infrastructure resilience for the colonial relationship, and especially in thinking about how Indigenous movements and communities are being pacified. And at the same time, thinking about what we can take away from this in terms of strategizing, when you have a security or resilience approach that is almost capitalizing, right, on the risks that, right, these movements are presenting to industry. Thank you.